The dead were piling up in the snow. Shots flew through the air as tanks exchanged constant fire. The huge number of corpses made it difficult for the soldiers to advance, while the stench of rotting bodies made it impossible to continue fighting. Nevertheless, the Soviets maintained their offensive. If they were defeated, Moscow, their glorious capital, would fall into the hands of the Nazis. Such were the battles of Rzhev. For more than a year, the men of the Red Army attacked the German defenses, seeking to expel them from their positions. But all they managed to do was dye the snowy ground of the city red. There were so many Soviet dead that this place became known by the macabre name of the meat grinder. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the clashes that took place in Rzhev, one of the bloodiest of the Second World War. By September 1941, just 3 months after the start of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi forces were close to accomplishing their mission. Kiev had fallen, and Leningrad was completely besieged and cut off from Soviet forces. Adolf Hitler, seeking to quickly eliminate his enemy, gave his men free rein to unleash the greatest cruelties imaginable against both Red Army soldiers and civilians. Joseph Stalin's forces, surprised by the magnitude of the offensive, had no chance to stop the initial attacks. The Russian armies were mercilessly destroyed. Thousands of soldiers died in a short period of time, but this nightmare had only just begun. Although the Soviet army greatly outnumbered the invaders, it could not stand up to their blitzkrieg doctrine. German infantry, supported by their armored vehicles and aircraft, destroyed Russian positions without slowing down their advance. The defenders' casualties increased at a frantic pace. The only strategy of his generals seemed to be to send even more men to the front, but this was far from yielding favorable results. What they got in return was the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Moscow was the only one of Hitler's main objectives still standing. On 2 October 1941, the Führer ordered the start of an offensive that he assumed. The battle began favorably for the Germans, who managed to capture approximately 600,000 Soviets and kill 100,000. Several important cities were also conquered, including Novgorod, Kursk, and Rzhev. However, it was at this time that the dreaded Russian autumn rains began, turning the terrain into a quagmire. The tanks could not advance, and many became stuck in the mud. The German generals recommended that Hitler halt the offensive and wait for the weather to improve, but the Führer flatly refused, not with Moscow so close. Convinced that the Soviets were about to break, he ordered them to continue. On December 2, 1941, when the Nazi armies resumed their attacks, they found it much more difficult to advance through the Moscow forests. Not only did the rain work against them, but the Soviet soldiers, defending the heart of their country, demonstrated iron will, fighting to the bitter end. The Red Army began an attack of its own, which was called the Winter Offensive. Now, without adequate clothing for the low Russian temperatures and discouraged by the failure of their plan, the Germans were the ones who began to drop like flies. By January 1942, the Soviets had managed to expel their enemies from the vicinity of Moscow. The capital was not yet completely safe, but it was no longer in imminent danger. Stalin, however, was not satisfied with these results. Only by completely eliminating the German presence in this area could he relax. The Nazis had retreated to the town of Rzhev, which was heavily fortified in anticipation of further Red offensives. Hitler had forbidden his troops to retreat even 1 more kilometer. Any soldier who did so risked being executed as a deserter. The position had to be defended to the last drop of blood. On January 8, 1942, Soviet generals gave the order to advance toward Rzhev. Hundreds of thousands of men rushed savagely against the German lines. Just as Hitler had done in the previous months, Stalin also thought that his enemy was close to breaking point, so he ordered an all-out attack. Three entire armies advanced against the Nazis' right flank, seeking to penetrate their forces, encircle and destroy them. But they had severely underestimated their rival. The Germans, even suffering from winter and lack of supplies, were able to organize a solid defense. Barbed wire barriers cut off all roads, and machine gun nests covered every forward point. After the Red Army men began their attack, Rzhev became a bloodbath. The number of Soviet dead was so great that they blocked the path of the survivors. In these so-called valleys of death, the attackers were forced to crawl on their bodies, stepping over the rotting corpses of their comrades. As the days passed without the communists being able to make any progress in their offensive, the smell of putrefaction became unbearable. Not even the extreme cold could prevent the stench from reaching the fighters. Due to the appalling conditions, contagious diseases became very common, further weakening the Red Army soldiers. Hitler, meanwhile, ordered divisions from other battlefronts to be transferred to Rzhev to continue the fight. Little by little, the numerical superiority turned in favor of the German side, while the number of wounded, maimed, or dead Soviets only increased. The lack of medicines on the battlefield meant that even the slightest injuries could be fatal. Due to a shortage of resources, the sick or wounded who could continue fighting were expelled from field hospitals and sent once again to the front. Stalin's orders remained the same. Eliminating the threat to Moscow was the only priority. By the end of January, the Soviets used an entire army to launch an attack on German positions west of Rzhev. But Nazi counteroffensives succeeded in cutting off the Russian supply line, and they were able to completely encircle their enemy. The fighting in that area lasted for months and was absolutely brutal. With each passing day, the number of defenders dwindled without reinforcements, ammunition, or food being brought in. Due to the staggering death toll, the Soviets dubbed Rzhev the meat grinder. On July 2, 1942, the Germans launched Operation Seydlitz with the goal of permanently eliminating the encircled Soviet army. The marshy terrain made it difficult for either side to use tanks, but German artillery outnumbered their enemy and managed to destroy a large number of battleships. The Russians attempted counteroffensives, but their weakened state was too much, and these attacks only increased their deaths. By 21st July, the Soviets had been almost completely eliminated. They suffered 60,000 casualties, most of them killed by Nazi bullets. The Germans, for their part, lost fewer than 4,000 men. Their victory seemed assured. But despite the exorbitant number of Russian corpses lying on the streets and fields of Rzhev, the Red Offensive had to continue. By mid-1942, the focus of the German campaign had turned south and towards the conquest of Stalingrad. Many divisions were sent to this front, which had become of vital importance to Hitler. It was then that the Soviet leader decided to try once more to eliminate the German armies that were threatening Moscow. On July 31st, this new offensive began. On this occasion, tanks played a key role in the development of the fighting. Approximately 1,500 tanks, counting those of both sides, took part in this second Battle of Rzhev. Tanks quickly exchanged gunfire, filling the air with smoke and the fields with the burning debris of destroyed vehicles. Crews who failed to escape from these steel cages were burned alive. The fighting was extremely brutal. Although his initial strategy had so far yielded no positive results, Stalin did not change it at all. He sent all his men to the front, without any kind of cover. As had happened in previous offensives, the Soviets fell like flies in front of the solid German defense, without achieving significant territorial gains. By early October, when the Soviet attack had run out of strength, the Red Army's losses almost reached 300,000. They had been completely decimated. The Germans also suffered greatly from their enemy's offensive. Not only were the Soviets closer to Rzhev than before, but 70,000 Nazis had perished in the attack. All the Germans had managed to do was maintain the status quo, and it was only a matter of time before the Russians tried again to recapture their city. This time would come on November 25, 1942. Taking advantage of the fact that the bulk of the German forces were still engaged in the conquest of Stalingrad, Stalin initiated Operation Mars. Once again, the Red Army launched a brutal attack on the Nazi defenses. The Soviets scored some initial victories, pushing deep into enemy positions. But the Germans quickly reorganized, and once again the dead began to pile up on the Soviet side. The meat grinder at Rzhev was still in full operation. The bad weather, filled with dense fog, meant that the Red Air Force and artillery pieces were unable to support their infantry. German machine guns mowed down men in droves, while anti-tank weapons and artillery destroyed most of the Soviet battleships. While Stalin's soldiers did make some territorial gains, they were far fewer than expected. By December 20th, 1942, 500,000 Russians had been wounded or killed, and the offensive had to be called off. Only days later, the miles they had gained were once again recaptured by the Nazis. Rzhev remained firmly in their hands. But this was not the case elsewhere on the front. At Stalingrad, what some German generals had thought would be a quick campaign had turned into the bloodiest battle of the entire Second World War. Not only that, but by February 1943, when the Nazi army there was finally defeated, the balance of power began to reverse throughout the Eastern Theater. Hitler's soldiers, shocked by the crushing annihilation of their forces, retreated. The Soviets did not waste this moment. Gathering all their resources, including the millions of men in reserve, they went on the attack. By March 1943, the German front had retreated hundreds of miles from its won positions, all the way to the town that bore the name of their enemy. At Rzhev, the German forces were still firmly entrenched, exchanging only sporadic fire with the enemy. However, news of their comrades' defeat at Stalingrad and subsequent flight reached them. Now, they knew they were in danger of being left behind if they did not begin their own retreat. Reluctantly, and certain that they would be wiped out by the inspired Soviets if they did not, Hitler ordered the city, whose defense had caused so many deaths, to be abandoned. When the Red Army launched its new and final attack against the invading forces, they met little resistance, which was quickly eliminated. After more than a year of bloody and brutal battles, Rzhev was in Soviet hands once again. The fighting there is often forgotten when discussing World War II, overshadowed by other, more spectacular clashes. Yet this small town became the graveyard of more than 1 million Soviets. German casualties are only slightly lower. Of the 20,000 citizens who were there when the Nazis arrived, only 362 remained in Rzhev when they fled. The town was reduced to rubble, with almost all of its buildings collapsed. Its reconstruction took decades. The enormous amount of death and destruction, of lives lost and affected by these battles, must be remembered. This is the intention behind the film, whose scenes are shown throughout the video. The film is simply called Rzhev, directed by Igor Kopylov and released in 2019, and seeks to show how brutal the fighting in this small town was. On the dawn of June 22, 1941, the world witnessed a battle that shook the foundations of Western civilization. Adolf Hitler's insatiable war machine unleashed its fury upon a completely unprepared Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of a conflict that would leave Europe drenched in innocent blood. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, the German invasion came as a lethal blow that shattered their illusion of security. The might of the Red Army, until then considered invincible, crumbled before the relentless onslaught of blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war. Entire cities burned under the bombardment, while the countryside was stained scarlet by the sacrifice of brave Russian soldiers. However, beyond the thunder of weapons, there was an even darker and more disturbing truth. Things did not unfold as the Führer had planned. Historians consider the failure of this plan a turning point in World War II and the beginning of the end of German superiority. Why ultimately did Operation Barbarossa, despite its bloody successes, signify a crucial defeat for the Third Reich? We invite you to watch this video, where we delve into the paradox of the Nazi regime's most successful operation and its most devastating failure. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare your coat for the harsh Russian winter. The ambitions of the Führer in the East were not mere territorial cravings, but a grotesque expression of his worldview. Stalin represented to him the embodiment of absolute evil, communism, the inferiority of the Slavs, and the specter of Jewish influence. In his delusions of grandeur, victory over Russia was not just a military objective, but a crusade to spread terror and death throughout Europe. Influenced by the swift and successful blitzkrieg against France in 1940, Nazi leaders optimistically considered the possibility of applying a similar strategy in their invasion of the Soviet Union. They relied on the potential of their advanced tanks and perceived Stalin's supposed vulnerability as that of a vast yet fragile clay giant that would easily crumble under the German onslaught. This perception fueled the belief that the conquest of the East would be a relatively quick and straightforward endeavor. During the initial weeks of the war, the blitzkrieg advanced rapidly, managing to invade Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It was on June 22, 1941, when the offensive was unleashed along a front spanning 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, catching the Russian leadership by surprise and finding the Red Army in a partially static state. German forces moved forward, with armored divisions under generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian achieving notable advances. Cities fell and vast areas were swiftly captured as the Nazis progressed toward their objectives. The resistance, although initially disorganized, proved resilient. Despite encirclements and overwhelming losses, Stalin's troops fought tenaciously, impeding the Nazi advance with fierce resistance and guerrilla tactics. In the south, German generals Gerd von Rundstedt and Ewald von managed to break through Soviet defenses and advance towards the Black Sea. Sieges at Kiev and Vyazma resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners. Nevertheless, pockets of resistance persisted, frustrating German attempts at total conquest.
К вам обращаемся, друзья мои. Вероломные военные нападения гитлеровской Германии на нашу родину начаты 22 июня.
Stalin, for his part, never believed in the materialization of Operation Barbarossa, and even in the initial stages of the conflict, when Soviet planes stationed were the target of enemy bombings, he sought to negotiate a solution. Despite constant warnings from Anglo-Saxon diplomacy, both British and American, the leader often smiled mockingly at the methods employed by his ally up to that point. However, this perception proved to be a serious error in judgment. Each previous alert had been different, and on this occasion, Hitler maintained a notable silence regarding his military movements, which was only broken half an hour before the roar of the cannons. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of the USSR, was crucial in Operation Barbarossa, while other regions were left to fend for themselves. The British blockade drove Nazism to take control of these food resources. Russian production was destined for the conquerors, and primitive agricultural crops were established in the new administrative division, led by Alfred Rosenberg. Poland was converted into a protectorate called Ostland, while Ukraine was granted independence to unite it with the Reich. On June 22, 1941, exactly 1 year after the surrender of France, Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, determined how German forces were divided for this operation. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with advancing towards Smolensk and then, according to the original plan, towards Moscow. However, they deviated north to assist Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, in its advance towards Leningrad. This division of forces was a controversial strategic decision and has been debated among historians. Some argue that the northern deviation was a tactical mistake that diluted the power of the advance towards Moscow, while others suggest it was a tactical necessity to secure the northern flank and supply lines in the campaign against Leningrad. In response, Georgy Zhukov, a prominent Soviet military leader, ordered the Red Army to attack and destroy the invader, but without crossing into Reich territory. Before that, the Russians requested Japan to act as an intermediary for a diplomatic solution, but when it became clear that there would be no such thing, it was announced that the USSR had been invaded and was at war. By that time, the Germans were already being ruthless and merciless with the Soviet population. Hitler told his commanders, "This is a war of extermination. If we do not understand this, we will defeat the enemy just the same, but 30 years later, we will have to fight the communists again. We do not wage war to preserve the enemy." The Einsatzgruppen, mobile units of the SS, unleashed a wave of terror in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Their main objective was to eliminate elements considered hostile to the Nazi regime, which included communists and Russian state officials. These shooting operations were primarily aimed at Jewish men, although other ethnic and political groups were also targeted. To carry out these atrocities, the Einsatzgruppen established ghettos and detention centers, where large numbers of prisoners were concentrated. They often collaborated with German army personnel, reflecting cooperation between different branches of the Nazi war machinery in the implementation of their genocidal policies. In Leningrad, the bloodiest and longest moment in history was established. In almost 900 days, hundreds of thousands of Russians died of starvation. That was the bet. Those who did not fall under Nazi bullets were to die from hunger. It seemed that all defenses in the east would be vulnerable. The Germans were fresh, there were millions of them. They had plenty of weapons. In late July 1941, leaders of the SS and police arrived in the Soviet Union, appointed by Himmler. With the support of local auxiliaries, they began to carry out mass executions of entire communities. This period witnessed an escalation in the systematic murder of innocent civilians as part of the Nazi strategy to eradicate those considered undesirable. On October 15, 1941, Hitler made the decision to deport German Jews to occupied Russia. The rapid advances on the military front and the horrendous crimes committed against the Soviets influenced this determination. This marked the beginning of what became known as the Final Solution, a policy that involved the physical annihilation not only of Jews in occupied territories, but of all those who inhabited Europe. This tragic chapter in European history led to the deaths of millions of innocent people in Nazi concentration camps. The letters sent by Nazi soldiers from the front to their families overflowed with messages of optimism and confidence. There was only room for victory. However, despite reaching the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941, the Germans against the invaders. The dream of capturing Moscow faded as Nazi casualties soared and the momentum of Operation Barbarossa stalled. In the south, Kleist's advance toward the Caucasus was halted, and Rundstedt's position in Rostov-na-Donu became untenable. The Soviet counterattack recaptured key territories, forcing the Germans to retreat and easing the pressure on Moscow. By the winter of 1941-1942, Operation Barbarossa had transformed from an ambitious conquest plan into a desperate struggle for survival. Logistics became a nightmare, exacerbated by Soviet scorched earth tactics that devastated the countryside and disrupted German movements. The Nazi army, ill-prepared to face the harsh Russian winter, found itself in the midst of an exhausting battle against nature and determined Soviet defenders. Despite initial advances, the invasion did not achieve its objectives, marking a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front and foreshadowing the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. The armament of both fronts was on such a gigantic scale that even today they are difficult to surpass. The Red Army had 24,000 tanks, but only a quarter of them were operational. Nazi intelligence severely underestimated this number, estimating that the Red Army had around 10,000 tanks in total. Additionally, the Soviets had developed two new models, the T-34 and the KV-1. These tanks were unknown to the Germans, who were unaware of their capabilities on the battlefield. As for the Air Force, the Red Air Force had a numerical advantage with around 8,000 aircraft, but many of them were in poor condition. The purges in the Red Army, which had eliminated many experienced officers, left command in the hands of men with limited military competence. Despite some changes after the Winter War, there wasn't enough time for thorough training. On the other hand, Benito Mussolini's blunders caused a delay of up to 5 weeks in Operation Barbarossa. The Italian fascist leader had decided to undertake a military campaign in Greece without the consent or proper coordination with his German ally, Adolf Hitler. This action diverted resources and delayed the execution of Operation Barbarossa. Many of those accused in the Nuremberg trials pointed to this fact as decisive for the failure, along with the ill-conceived plan to capture Moscow just before the arrival of winter. The Nazi forces were left at the outskirts of the Russian capital and very different. The fall of Moscow, the jewel of the Soviet crown, would have been a monumental feat, a blow that would have resonated in the annals of history and perhaps determined the end of World War II in Hitler's favor. Ultimately, today's new world order would have been different if Operation Barbarossa had had a different outcome. Another crucial aspect of Operation Barbarossa and the beginning of the campaign to the east was its role as a turning point in the Holocaust. From then on, the persecution and murder of Jews were carried out systematically and without disguise. The Nazis did not miss any opportunity to commit atrocities, extending their cruelty to the territories they left behind as they advanced in their military invasion. Despite the adversities on the Russian front, they continued with the extermination relentlessly.
The offensive was over. But looking at the whole picture as Barbarossa came to a halt, Germany still seemed to be in a good position. Army Group North was sure that the besieged Leningrad was about to fall. Army Group Center were at the gates of Moscow, and Army Group South had taken the Ukraine and Kiev. When the new year came, they planned to finish the job. However, little did they know, the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve.
Despite the massive German advance, the Russians managed to redeploy most of the divisions stationed in the eastern part of the Soviet Union, those facing Mongolia and Japan, upon discovering that the Japanese had no intention of attacking. These were not just inexperienced troops, but well-equipped field divisions, many trained for winter warfare from the icy lands of Siberia. This strategic movement was crucial for Soviet defense. The divisions transferred from the east bolstered the forces already deployed on the Western Front and strengthened resistance capabilities against the Nazi offensive. The ability of these divisions to operate effectively in a cold and hostile environment proved pivotal in halting the Wehrmacht's advance and altering the course of the war. As Operation Barbarossa drew to a close, Nazi forces and their allies faced a challenging reality on the Eastern Front. Despite initial advances, including the capture of Kiev and the siege of Leningrad, they encountered fierce resistance from the Red Army, which nearly succeeded in completely thwarting their advances as they dangerously approached Moscow. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, loomed on the horizon as an even more intense and challenging phase of the conflict in the East. After 1945, the Wehrmacht elite systematically embarked on constructing a narrative portraying the German army as blameless, shifting responsibility for crimes committed in Eastern Europe onto the SS. The idea spread that the Nazis were responsible for the atrocities, while the army conducted the conflict in accordance with international law. This narrative of innocence was embraced eagerly by those serving in its ranks. Even the ordinary soldier asserted, "I fought for a clean army, not for a criminal group." Thus, a collective absolution took place, a relief of conscience that endured for decades. It took a long time before historical inquiry in Germany could begin to dismantle that narrative. It was not until 1995 that a significant debate on the subject erupted in Nazi society, driven by the exhibition Crimes of the Nazi Army, War of Annihilation between 1941 and 1944. The exhibition presented documentary evidence, witness testimonies, and shocking photographs revealing the true nature of the war in the East and the central role of the German army in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It also highlighted the complicity and collaboration of many German military units in the atrocities committed by Nazi occupation forces in conquered territories. In conclusion, few historical events contain such an evident contradiction as this. It represented Nazi Germany's greatest momentary triumph, yet simultaneously marked the beginning of its decline. The day Adolf Hitler celebrated what he considered his greatest victory also became the turning point that sealed the catastrophic fate of his regime. The continuation of the Eastern Campaign ultimately trapped and irreversibly weakened the Third Reich. August 1945. After thousands of bombings, millions of shots fired, and countless hand-to-hand combats, silence falls. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany is a cause for celebration in every corner of Europe. However, the roar of war is still heard loudly in the Pacific. There, the United States and Japan have fought to the death for the past few years, but a new contender has just burst in with a brutal offensive. This is Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, which sent more than 1.5 million men to face the Imperial Army in Manchuria, the occupied lands in the northwest of China. The battle turns into a true massacre that dyes the plains and mountains alike red. While in Tokyo, they try to deal with the atomic bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another piece of news shocks the emperor. 100,000 of his soldiers have been annihilated by the USSR. In this new military history video, we will learn everything about the savage war unleashed by the Soviets on the Asian front. The brutality experienced in just a few days can only be compared to the violence the Nazis experienced in Stalingrad. Now, it is the Japanese who must decide between surrendering or dying in the face of a devastating enemy. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan by sending 1,600,000 soldiers into the occupied territory of Manchuria in northeastern China. The forces were under the command of Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. Their objective, to advance towards the rest of the country Korea, and also the Kuril Islands, forcing the enemy to retreat quickly. However, the USSR was aware that it was facing a powerful army made up of 1 million men from the empire. That invasion meant the fulfillment of the promise made by Stalin to the British and American leaders. He had assured that he would join the battle against the Japanese after the defeat of Nazi Germany, regardless of the non-aggression agreement he had with Tokyo since 1941. In fact, the Asian country expected the Soviets to mediate to achieve peace with the Allied forces, but that would never happen. In this way, in the midst of a historic milestone such as the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a brutal offensive was launched to definitively crush the resistance of the Japanese Empire. The fighting against the United States had been going on for several years. Both countries lost an innumerable number of men in the conflict. However, the American country changed the logic of war conflicts forever with the invention of the nuclear bomb. This deadly weapon was used for the first time on August 6, 1945 in the city of Hiroshima, razing an entire city in a matter of seconds. Still unable to process the trauma of the deaths, 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Radiation invaded the Asian country, but it did not arrive alone. A storm was brewing on another front. The remote lands of Manchuria were preparing for an unprecedented massacre, a confrontation so fierce that despite not having the destructive power of the bombs, it would cause an equally catastrophic number of deaths. It was a lightning offensive that unleashed relentless fighting in Northwest Asia, marking the last major ground battle of World War II. The Red Army, hardened in the bloodiest battles on the European front, was determined to finish off the proud and feared Kwantung troops as quickly as possible. A spectacle of fire and death was about to begin.
No fewer than 136,000 railway wagons were used as victorious Soviet forces from the west journeyed up to 12,000 kilometers to take up positions in the east. By early August, 1.6 million men were ready to take part in the Manchuria attack.
As we have already mentioned, the operation began on August 9, 1945, but preparations had begun several weeks earlier. There was a deceptive calm that preceded the furious battle. The silence of the Siberian steppes was only interrupted by the sound of Soviet trains transporting soldiers, tanks, and ammunition towards the border with Manchuria. The Red Army was preparing for an attack that would seek to end the war. The order came directly from Moscow. Stalin, with his sights set on consolidating the USSR's influence in East Asia, knew that the destruction of the Kwantung Army was the key to forcing the Japanese surrender. The Soviet military deployment was massive. It mobilized more than 1.5 million men, who would also be backed by thousands of tanks, planes, and heavy artillery. Grouped into 3 main fronts, they would use all the experience acquired in the recent confrontation against the Nazis. Those years of relentless fighting had turned them into an efficient, ruthless, and lethal force. The tension was palpable. Soldiers hardened by the horrors of Stalingrad knew what was coming. Many had lost friends, family, and comrades on the European front. Now they prepared for the final battle. But this time, the enemy was different. One who was desperately fighting to protect the remaining possessions of their crumbling empire. The Kwantung Army, once the jewel of Asian power, was now a shadow of its former self. Its best men and resources had been diverted to the defense of Japan's main islands. Those who remained were poorly trained soldiers, poorly armed, and without the proper equipment to face the destructive power that was approaching. But still, Honor and tradition compelled them to resist. Therefore, the Soviets debated different ways of how to advance on the enemy before making the final decision.
There was some thought given to the idea of a staggered attack, to advance from the west before engaging the troops on the other side of the country. But in the end, it was those who argued for a simultaneous attack whose opinion prevailed. So the Trans-Baikal Front, the Second Far Eastern Front, and the First Far Eastern Front all attacked together.
From the north, east, and west, Red Army troops began their offensive, advancing with a precision that only war veterans could achieve. The sheer number of troops posed a challenge for coordination, but the Soviet war machine was perfectly oiled. The darkness of the night became the great ally of the enormous force, invisible to the eyes of the enemy despite its size. Soon, Japan's fighters were in for a huge and unwanted surprise.
At first, the Japanese failed to notice the almost silent companies of infantry and supporting engineers. When the advancing Soviets arrived at the first of the Japanese defensive positions, they were still well protected by the cover of night, and the full reality of the situation now revealed itself to the Japanese forces.
The silence was broken by the deafening roar of Soviet artillery. T-34 tanks crushed Japanese defenses like paper, while waves of infantry followed suit, advancing deep into Manchuria. The skies darkened with smoke from the bombing raids. Stalin's planes dropped huge amounts of explosives on Japanese positions, reducing their rivals' fortifications and command centers to rubble. The soldiers in Tokyo had never seen an offensive of such magnitude. Despite the efforts of the Kwantung Army, they were quickly outnumbered. They were caught in a whirlwind of destruction. Casualties piled up with each passing hour. Japanese lines collapsed under the overwhelming force of the Soviets. The sound of explosions, the screams of the wounded, and the incessant machine gun fire created the perfect symphony of horror. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the intensity of the attack. In a desperate attempt to halt the enemy advance, Imperial troops launched suicidal counterattacks. Small infantry units armed only with bayonets and grenades rushed towards the Soviet tanks with blind determination. However, the enemy's armored vehicles advanced mercilessly, crushing any resistance with tons of steel. Within days, the Red Army had crossed dozens of kilometers of enemy territory, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake.
It was the 11th of August before the Japanese were able to regroup in any sort of order, by which time Fifth Army had advanced 80 kilometers into Manchurian territory. The Japanese had been taken completely by surprise, and the Soviet Fifth Army had exceeded their own expectations. By the 11th of August, advance troops were heading towards the vital city of Mutanqiang, headquarters of the Japanese First Area Army. The plan was to take the city within 18 days.
As the Soviets moved closer to the mountains and deserts of Manchuria, the situation became even more desperate. Japanese units, unable to organize a coherent defense, tried to take refuge on higher ground, hoping that the difficult geographical conditions would slow the enemy advance. Unfortunately for them, this was not to be the case. The USSR forces continued to march forward with the same relentless brutality, no matter what surface they found themselves on. Airstrikes continued to punish the enemy, while infantry troops traversed narrow and treacherous paths, ambushing Japanese men trapped in unfavorable terrain. The fighting in the mountains was fierce and intense. Soviet patrols surprised enemies in the valleys, and hand-to-hand fighting with knives, bayonets, and grenades was common. Battle cries and the whistling of bullets never stopped. For many Japanese soldiers, there was no escape. Those who did not fall in the fighting perished on the steep slopes or were lost in the deserts. Casualties multiplied on both sides, but the Asian forces, exhausted and poorly equipped, suffered the most. The number of dead and wounded was immeasurable. In the end, the mountains and deserts of Manchuria that seemed to represent the Japanese salvation became vast improvised cemeteries where the bodies of thousands of fallen soldiers were abandoned. The Soviet offensive was a true unstoppable storm that knew no mercy, and for the Japanese, there was no more refuge.
All over eastern Manchuria, the Japanese were stunned by the Soviet assault. Earlier in 1945, the Kwantung Army leadership had accepted the need for a defensive strategy in the event of a Soviet attack. The plan was to engage the invaders immediately, before staging an orderly withdrawal to the plains region in the south, while continuing to harry the enemy at every opportunity. The hope was that the Soviet troops would then be tired and vulnerable to a counterattack.
It was a realistic strategy from the Japanese Empire's point of view, but reality proved that the speed of the Soviet assault prevented any kind of response. Moreover, the attack was not only lethal on the ground. After the first days of the offensive, the skies of Manchuria had become a battlefield of their own. The Red Army's fighters and bombers dominated the air, taking the war to a new dimension. From the first light of dawn, the wings of the planes crossed the horizon, leaving behind them trails of smoke and devastation. The Soviet pilots, veterans of the violent aerial combats over Europe, now displayed their experience against an outnumbered and disorganized enemy. Tokyo's aircraft, which knew how to dominate Asia, were now scarce and poorly maintained. Within a few days, the imperial forces in Manchuria practically ceased to exist. Their planes were torn apart in the air or destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Meanwhile, USSR bombers continued to drop their deadly load on enemy positions, reducing defensive structures and supply centers to rubble. Columns of Japanese tanks and troops tried to reorganize quickly. However, they became easy targets for Stalin's aircraft, which attacked them mercilessly with explosives or machine guns from above. Chaos was absolute. Japanese soldiers ran desperately seeking shelter in improvised trenches, only to be hit by artillery fire. Those who managed to survive the bombing were almost immediately confronted by the advanced Soviet forces, which arrived like a whirlwind, destroying what was left of the rival defenses. On the ground, the Red Army's tanks were unstoppable. Rows of armored vehicles moved across the vast plains of Manchuria, destroying any resistance. Without any kind of inventiveness or innovative tactics, the Japanese continued to bet on suicide missions by driving vehicles packed with explosives towards their adversaries. The Kwantung Army, the Japanese pride, was on the brink of total annihilation. Once praised as the empire's most powerful in Asia, the command had underestimated the Soviet ability to launch such a swift and devastating offensive. Within days, the renowned troops had been decimated. The Red Army's advance had not only been rapid, but also brutally efficient. Stalin's forces smashed through Japanese defenses and captured key cities with equal ease. Ports and communication routes were at their mercy with astonishing speed. The Soviet plan was clear: not to let the Japanese forces have a moment's respite, and to crush any attempt at reorganization before it could even begin. In many cases, Japanese troops were unable to cope with the overwhelming power of their enemy. Entire units of the Kwantung Army surrendered without even firing a shot. Their officers were aware of the futility of continuing the fight.
Soviet attackers were now full of the confidence generated by the speed of their advance. The original invasion plan anticipated the capture of Mutanchiang by the 18th day of hostilities. But as early as day 3, General Krylov was able to dispatch an advance party of 5th Army to test the Japanese defenses at Mutanchiang. The result was clear. The Japanese forces were engaged in a continuing withdrawal in the face of Soviet armor and especially artillery.
Other Japanese commanders, blinded by honor and the defense of their homeland, chose to fight on, giving themselves over to almost certain death. The massacres that followed were devastating. Japanese casualties continued to mount by the day. The Kwantung Army was destroyed in the field, and its officers were captured. The Soviets took hundreds of thousands of prisoners, many of whom were sent to labor camps in Siberia. For Japan, the loss of this unit marked the end of its dominance in continental Asia and ended hopes of meaningful resistance. That emblem of power, the once feared and respected troop, was reduced to ashes.
The sheer speed of the invasion had taken them by surprise. In the face of an army marching forward at 100 kilometers per day, the defending forces had little choice but to withdraw into fortified positions, to be taken out at the leisure of the Soviet commanders. A well-organized retreat was impossible under the circumstances, and by the 14th of August, after just 5 days of fighting, the Japanese leadership knew that the battle for Manchuria was effectively over.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. For many soldiers in Manchuria, the news came too late. The destruction of their lands was irreversible, and the suffering continued. The battlefields were littered with corpses and devastated vehicles. They were a grim reminder of the ferocity of the operation. Despite everything, Soviet soldiers continued to advance like a bulldozer without brakes, capturing stragglers and eliminating the last pockets of resistance. For Japanese civilians living in the occupied regions, the arrival of Stalin's troops represented only one thing: terror. Many fled or committed suicide in the face of the approaching invasion. For them, the atrocities committed during the capture of cities by the Red Army were worse than death. On the other side of the fence, in the USSR, the enormous success of the operation that had been launched just a few weeks earlier was celebrated. Not only had the famed Kwantung Army been defeated, but it had also managed to secure key territories and force Japan to accept unconditional surrender. True, the price had been high. Soviet forces suffered around 12,000 casualties in their ranks. But that number seems very small compared to the nearly 100,000 deaths that Japanese troops had to endure. The attack had been truly devastating. As if that were not enough, the operation also changed the geopolitical map of Asia, marking the end of Japan's imperial era. The lost territories included Manchuria, North Korea, the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands. Every inch occupied by Stalin's men would never again be controlled by Tokyo. A new history began for the region, albeit with deep and permanent scars for a population that lived through the bloody battle up close. A reign of blood that culminated on September 2, 1945, when the Japanese formally signed their surrender. Thus, the worst conflict the world has ever known came to an end. Now, after having experienced the last and fiercest battle of World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having joined us. We look forward to seeing you in the next military history video.